We're back at it again, guys. I'm Tyler with Leggari Products. We manufacture and sell extremely user-friendly products to transform any surface. But in this video, we're gonna go over how to prep countertops the right way, whether it's tile, Formica, granite, or even custom-built wood tops. After watching this, you guys are gonna be prepping like pros, and your countertops are gonna last for years.
We want to talk about how to prepare your countertops for one of our countertop kits. Now, obviously, most people are going over existing counters. You can go over Formica, granite, obviously laminate is another name for Formica, marble, even tile, or you can build counters like this. We're gonna talk mostly about building counters like this and a little bit about going over the other types of counters. So this is really, really simple, guys. You can actually design counters any way you want, as far of an overhang as you want, the thickness that you want. That's the beauty of building them yourselves. But we wanna show you how these were built. So we actually used 3 layers of 1/2" MDF, medium density fiberboard. You can use 2 3/4" layers, but we'd like to see a minimum of about 1.5 inches. You don't want to use just 1/2" layer because it'll be pretty flimsy. The reason why we like MDF is because it doesn't warp. It's always flat. They really compress that, so there's no warping. And then once the layers are set up, it's always trimmed out by another straight board. Obviously, trim is also manufactured to be very straight. So we like to put a piece of wood on the face, and what it does is it hides all the seams of the layers of the wood. We'd rather have a seam up top like this than on the faces, because the faces are coated and they're coated much thinner. You have a tendency to notice those a lot more. And if you come over here, you can actually see exactly how it was built. So we have the 3 layers of the 1/2" MDF, and then we have it trimmed out. Now, this overhang right here is 2 inches. You can go with 1.5 inches. We like 2 inches just because it's easier to do plastic, things like that. The drip edge is hanging farther over the plastic. It kind of makes it really nice. So when you're building these, it's really important that you glue in between every layer, and it's important that you either screw, or like we did here, we used some brad nails. The glue's doing the majority of the work, but it's really important that you don't just glue them together and think it's going to hold. You want to really hold it tight while that glue's setting up. If you're using screws, make sure that you sink the screws below the level of the surface. You can't have any screws sitting up or you'll always see them. Make sure you're sinking the screws down. And it's better to have them down underneath the surface, not even flush. A lot of people think, well, I'll just make them flush. A lot of times they are sticking up a little bit. So just screw them down below the surface if you're using them. Notice we put the face on, it was glued, and it also had some brad nails put on the front here as well. Now, going over here, this would be like your sink area. Now, obviously, this is cut out for the sink. We're going to plastic all of this off. If you're going over existing countertops, like Formica countertops or granite or anything else, it's easiest if you remove the sink. If for some reason it's just a pain in the butt, or you have a big old, garbage disposal on there, there's a lot of pipes, you don't want to have to move it, what you can do is you can pry that sink up, raise it about 1/2 inch, and put something underneath the lip. Maybe put a couple Sharpies under the sides of it, and what that'll do is you'll roll it underneath the lip and you won't see them, and it leaves it elevated so that you can coat underneath the sink. And when you're done, you can pull those out and drop that sink back down. Again, guys, it's for all the trouble, it's really easiest to just remove the sink completely. Sometimes you just don't have that option. Let's see, what else is really important? Sometimes you'll have tile on the backsplash. You'll want to tape high, about 1/8 of an inch high on that tile backsplash, and we'll show you a trick to really stop or minimize completely the opportunity for the epoxy to get up and kind of get on your backsplash. Another important thing is that you make sure the counters are level. Even if you have existing countertops, don't assume that whoever put those countertops put them on their level, because a lot of people aren't using a liquid product like this. If you put Formica or Granite on, they maybe didn't check the level of the cabinet itself, or again, Formica, when they're gluing that on, the Formica actually doesn't have to be level, even though it looks level. So you want to make sure that it's level both ways. All of these, that's really important. It's not gonna kill the entire job if it's out of sync just a little bit, but you want that bubble in between the lines. You want it as level as you can possibly get. That's gonna give you the greatest chance of success to make sure these counters look absolutely beautiful.
All right, so the next step is patching seams, gaps, imperfections, anything where the resin can flow through and not level out on the surface. So we're gonna be using all-purpose putty, extremely good product, bonds to anything. It dries fast, so you do wanna mix small amounts. And I'll kind of walk through what we're gonna be filling. So any gaps, like right here, we have a small gap. We gotta make sure these are filled. Nail holes will get filled. The top gap will get filled. It's a little height difference here, so we're gonna level that out. So we're basically gonna go around, fill everything to where it's a seamless surface. And then the faces are the most crucial part, because the resin is not as thick there. It doesn't hide as well. It doesn't cover as well, any imperfections. So if you have chips or gouges or chips on your edges, we have to fill those. Nail holes got to get filled. And then when we sand it, we got to get this nice and smooth. So I'll go through mixing. What we're gonna need are gloves, screwdriver to pop the lid off, a paint stick, and then just a putty knife to apply the Bondo. A mask, because this stuff does have an odor. Make sure you got a ventilated area, open a window. But yeah, this is pretty much it. So we'll just get started here. I'm gonna pop this top off. So the Bondo comes with a hardener, a cream hardener. So we'll pour a little out, we'll add the hardener, blend it, and then it'll be ready to go. So I'll get this started and then I'll throw on my mask. So the Bondo's really thick, so we're just gonna mix this up a little bit in here. You can kind of see some of the resin in there's kind of got to the surface. Mix that in. So that's ready. So before I put on my mask, I'll just walk you through the mixing process. I'm gonna get a little bit out of the can, and then I'm gonna squeeze out just a little bead across the middle, and then I'll take my putty knife, mix that in really good, right? Until it's all one consistent color, and then we'll be ready to go. You wanna mix small batches because this stuff does set up really quick, so I'm gonna be mixing multiple batches. So I'm pushing this down into that seam really hard because I want to make sure it gets in there and fills that. You can see a little gap there still. All right, so we basically went through that batch. Tim's gonna mix up some more. We just wanna make sure we don't have any really thick spots. So like if you have stuff out on the counter, right? Scrape it up. That way we don't have to waste time sanding that. And you can see where I mixed. I went and scraped all that up, so I don't have to waste time sanding that. And then just look and make sure all the gaps are filled. Stuff like this isn't a big deal. We can sand that down. But you can just flatten that off. So now we got those tops done. I got a little left here, and then we'll go and do all the nail holes or screw holes, whatever you have in the faces.
Okay, while Tyler's finishing up these edges, I'm gonna show you a really cool look you can do on the faces. I'm gonna show you 2 different crushed rock, more natural looks you can do on the edge of your counters. Now, obviously these were built, but even if you're going over Formica or granite, you can sand off any factory finish and then go directly on that. This stuff will stick very well to Formica or any other stone, different surfaces like that, even tile once you've sanded off the factory finish. So when you go buy a piece of granite or marble, a lot of times they'll offer you very expensive, but options for the edges if you want it to look natural and crushed. So that's what we're going to do here. So it's the same process, but we use quite a bit for this. So if you decide to do this, you'll probably have to get a few of these cans depending on how many faces you have in your kitchen or your countertop area. So same thing. Gonna mix this up a bit. This hardener's kind of acting really fluid. It should still work fine though. Doesn't take much to mix in this hardener, and it makes it pretty easy if you have someone mixing smaller batches, so the person doing the edges or the patching can just continue what they're doing. And guys, I'm not wearing a mask because I'm going to explain this, but we'll put a mask on right when I'm done explaining it. So what you're going to want to do is, I want this to be just kind of a face that really flows, very gradual. This will be a more radical, like crushed rock look. So I'm just going to begin to cake this stuff on. What I want to do is I want to leave it anywhere from a 1/2 inch thick to a 1/4 of an inch thick, and you want it coated from the top of the edge all the way to the bottom. Just make sure you really have it caked on. And then what we'll do, I'll just show you the first part here. So we want to take this trowel and we just kind of want to make it flow. I'm just moving it back and forth. I'm pushing it down. I'm relieving the pressure. And it's going to look a little crazy at first, trust me, I know. But once we sand this, it's gonna come alive a little bit. So don't worry about it too much, but like, see how this kind of flows right here? This looks really good. I might just flatten it off a couple more times, pushing up and down. What I want to get rid of is anything like this for this particular look. I don't want any like sharp edges and pockets. Like underneath here is kind of like a pocket. That makes it kind of hard to flow. So you do want the look of this to flow. If I need to add more here because I need more of a bump, that's fine. You can just go down, indent it a little bit, come back out. But I want to go all the way across this counter and really make it just kind of flow. And at the same time, I can also obviously hit the top of this just like Tyler was doing. It's not quite there, but almost. And the more radical you want these faces, the more you can cake on. Like this is sticking out over 1/2 inch over here. I can actually leave this up really high, create some really radical indents like that, and we can leave it like that. We're gonna sand a lot of this. We're gonna sand the bottom, the tops, but I do wanna scrape if I have like a lot of excess on here. I do wanna get rid of some of that stuff, and we can scrape this and we can cut it here in a minute too. My biggest concern is looking at the faces and making sure that there's not a lot of pockets. Like I would consider this a pocket. I would consider this a pocket. So I would just try to flatten those out, and that'll make more sense later. But this particular look looks better if there's not a lot of those pockets in there. We can even leave this and make that look really good. We don't have to mess with the top too much. I'm not worried about this. I'm not worried about any of these parts sticking well above the counter. This will look like a really cool natural look on the front. Now I'll show you a little bit more radical one that we would consider this probably a crushed rock face. So that's another one. Now this one is probably a little bit easier to do, but honestly they're both very easy to do, especially if you have someone mixing batches and you're just going over, you're just doing like a foot or two at a time. You know, we've been doing this kind of stuff for quite a while, so we can do larger sections like that. And this process works whether you're doing epoxy countertops, concrete overlay countertops, any of our countertop kits, you can do these rock faces. So I'm gonna hit the top of this again, just to get that out of the way. And guys, don't worry if you screw up on these a little bit. You can always sand. There's a lot of grace with this stuff because you can always sand. Obviously, I'm not as worried about messing with these holes on the front because we're doing this crushed rock look. So the next thing you want to do for this look is we're just going to put a thin coat across this whole thing. It doesn't have to be crazy thick. Anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch. You might even be able to get away with a little bit less. Nice thin coat on everything. Not crazy thick. It's not going to screw up the design if you do have it a little bit thick. It's not going to really mess it up. There's just no point necessarily. So once I have it pretty flat, all we're gonna do now is we're just gonna clean off our scraper a little bit, and we're just gonna put it flat on the face and pull straight out. And trust me, I know it looks like an absolute wreck, but that's why this is so easy. You almost can't screw this up, and you'll be blown away at what this looks like once we sand it down. Looks like a bunch of stalactites there. And then notice how it's kind of like drooping here. We can pull it out again and pull up a little bit so it doesn't droop so much. So when I'm pulling out, I'm actually pulling up a little bit. But that looks pretty good. You want these things sticking out all over the place. You can even do a really radical area if you want. It just depends on how thick you want it. Notice how big you can get those drips if you cake it on a lot more. Just kind of depends on the look you're going for. So we'll finish this up and then we'll show you the next step in terms of finishing these counters. But notice how easy this is. This isn't hard to do for just a little bit extra look. So when you're happy with the consistency of all of these peaks, what you can do it'll make sanding go a lot faster is you can clean off the edge of your trowel or your scraper, and then you can just kind of hit some of these flat a little bit. Like notice how radical this peak is. We can just hit that a little bit flat so you're not sanding for a really long time.
So one last thing I want to point out, when you guys are filling in your holes on the faces, whether it's a screw or a brad nail, and you scratch it tight and it's not wanting to fill, there's always like a gap there. You can just leave it a little thicker like I did over here, and just kind of flatten it off and not try to scrape it completely flat, because this will sand relatively easy. So if you run into that issue, just leave it on a little bit thicker in them spots and that'll help fill it. All right guys, so I'm gonna go over sanding the Bondo. Obviously these are built countertops. Same process for going over Formica. So you definitely wanna scuff up the surface of Formica. A lot of times the Formica doesn't sand really well on the top. It's really hard to sand. So if that's the case, just focus on your faces and your corners. Another big thing I want to hit on is never coat over a square corner. You always want your corners rounded a little bit. That's going to let the resin flow over nice, make your edges look good. If you coat over a square counter, it kind of creates a dam right here, and it'll never flow over nice and look good. So always round your corners. You can also router your edges, your corners, stuff like that. You can also sand even Formica. Say your Formica is a square corner, you can just take 80 grit sandpaper and kind of round that down a little bit. It'll sand through. You don't have to get a big corner or round to it. You can do just a small one. Another reason we like doing when we build counters is doing the base trim, because it's rounded on the top and it's rounded on the bottom. Another issue people run into is Formica, it's flat on the bottom and square, and it'll do the same thing. It'll want to dam up and have a little bead down here after the resin's even cured. So if you take the time and round your bottom corner just a little, that'll help the resin flow and drip off and not build up on the bottom edge. So what I'm gonna be sanding with is 80 grit sandpaper. And what I like to do first is do my corners. I don't wanna palm sand these corners because it's really easy to sand them too much. So I like to do these by hand. Just get a little bit round to it. And again, it doesn't take much, right? We just want to get a little bit of a nice corner that the resin can flow over. So that's what I do first. I just go around, hit my corners. You can do it last, doesn't matter. Do that, and then I'm gonna be sanding the rest with the palm sander, 80 grit sandpaper, and then obviously hooked to a vacuum to minimize dust. But yeah, it's relatively simple to sand to prep it. Again, this is for building countertops with wood or going over Formica. Tim's gonna go over, prep for tile, granite, concrete, stuff like that. So we'll get started on this. So that's basically it. That's kind of the process. And I like to run my hand after I've sanded, because you'll be able to feel something that's maybe high versus, just trying to look at it. Check your faces. And again, the most critical part is getting these faces nice and smooth without any imperfections. So take the time, run your hands across it, make sure everything's good. And then you just kind of continue that process throughout the counters. So if your sander's not sanding good, it's obviously getting clogged up. So you want to just swap it out. You can also even do a heavier grit. You could do 60 grit when you're doing the sanding the Bondo. You really don't want to do 60 grit on your faces because you'll sand through it really fast. But top, trying to get through a lot of Bondo, throw some 60 grit on there and that'll help you out. All right, so we got the island done. Now what I'm gonna do before I move on is just run my hands everywhere, even on the underneath, because we might have left a chunk of Bondo or something fell on there. So I wanna make sure there's no rough spots. Like right here, if you come over here, you can see a we got some Bondo on the bottom here, right? And I probably wouldn't have seen that if I was just, you know, looking. So you'll be able to get another little spot here. Doesn't take much to sand that off. Awesome, so the island's done. Sanded the edges, faces, sanded the top. I'll continue the process out here. And then when we get to here, you guys will see how to sand your decorative edges. So tops are done. Didn't do my faces yet. And hit these edges real quick. So I'll do the 80 grit on the faces. We'll try the 80 grit on here, see how it does. If you want to go a heavier grit for sanding the decorative edge, we could do that also. So again, I'll do the final walk around. Again, we got a couple chunks on the bottom here. Make sure everything feels nice and smooth. And don't worry if you're sanding through on spots. You just want to make sure you're holding that palm sander level with the face. You want to hold it at an angle because you'll dig in. So just remember to hold that level. All right, so we'll start with the 80 grit on this, and then if we need to get a heavier grit, we'll switch it out. So just kind of feeling the bottom, making sure that edge is good. Got a little bit of chunks on there I'll clean up. And it's up to you how much you want to sand it or how flat you want to get it. You obviously don't want it like pokey to where if you walk by it'll catch your shirt or something. But even as the resin and the primers flow over, it'll really fill a lot of those spots in and look really nice. So yeah, I just got to sand the top on that one. And then these are basically all prepped. So same process with Formica tops, if you build your wood tops. And then once this is all done, we'll vacuum it. And when you're doing edges like this, you really want to vacuum these good, maybe even take a brush or like a compressor to blow all the air out, or all the dust out of all these pockets. That's pretty much it. Another reason we like the MDF is because it's already a smooth, it's not really rough or textured like plywood and stuff. So what we'll do now is we'll vacuum the tops off, wipe it clean, and then we can start the process of coating the counters. All right, so we're gonna vacuum. I'm just using a squeegee attachment. We took the squeegee out, so I'll vacuum the tops. I'll pop the squeegee off, hit my edges, and I'll kind of show you that. It's really, really simple. So for your crushed edge, a lot of these vacuums come with some attachments with some brushes on them. So I can use this and really get in that edge, work all that dust out. All right, so sanding's done. Now we're gonna wipe it down. We're just gonna get a wet rag, a damp rag. We don't wanna get a lot of water on it. Wipe down the top, the edges, get it really, really clean. Another thing you can do, because it's nice to not have dust right on your plastic in case you need to use epoxy that dripped on the plastic or something. So we'll take a battery powered blower. We'll just blow the dust lightly out of this area. And then we'll do the wipe down the counter. That way we don't have a lot of dust on the plastic just in case we need to use some resin that dripped off or something. All right, so I got my damp rags here. Blower, I'm just gonna blow this out a little bit. Obviously you don't wanna blow it with some high pressure air, right? We don't wanna rip the plastic down, so it doesn't take much. All right, so we'll wipe the counters, and then once we wipe them, there shouldn't be a lot of dust on there, and we can blow those off as well. So again, just a damp rag. We don't want to get a lot of water on it. The cleaner we can get this, the less debris and stuff that could wind up in our epoxy. So want to keep swapping the rag around. You can see how much sawdust we're kind of getting off of these. That's a good one there. It's like half a shirt. We didn't Bondo here because this is where the stove goes, oven. You're never gonna see it. You guys can Bondo that if you want. It's totally up to you. So these will take a little bit extra care, just trying to get in all the crevices and stuff. All right, so we'll do a final wipe just real quick with some clean rags. See how they're still getting a little dirty. All right, guys, wipe your hand across it. Shouldn't get any dust or debris. You got a clean top. Now I'll do a quick blow off of the top just to get any remaining dust off or anything that's on it, and we'll be ready to go. All right, so if you guys have trim backsplashes, obviously we don't have a backsplash here, it's just a painted wall, but it is textured. So we're gonna show you a cool little trick if you're going over, say, a tile backsplash where there's grout lines. You never can really get the tape to bond really well where the grout is, and you get bleed marks. So the best way to tape that off is you wanna tape a little bit high because we don't want the epoxy to lock the tape in. And you can see we have a gap back here too. We don't wanna just waste resin down there running down the back side. So we're gonna tape this high. We're gonna run a strip of tape on here, and then we'll do a thin bead of latex caulk. You gotta make sure it's paintable. You do not wanna use a silicone on here because nothing sticks to silicone. So it's gotta be a paintable latex caulk without silicone. Small bead, that's gonna lock the tape in from bleeding, and it's also gonna fill in any gaps back here. So really critical when you're going over tile with grout lines, push the tape in really well, and then run that thin bead of caulking on there to lock that tape in so you don't get bleed marks. So I'll run a strip on the counter just so we don't make a mess here. Again, you want to be a little bit high. Last thing you want to have to do is cut your tape out because you taped too low and the epoxy locked it in there. Next thing, we want to push down that seam where we're going to be caulking into. Make sure all that's pushed down really good. All right, so I'll just do this section, show you guys, and then I'll finish the rest. So we're using just clear. If you're doing, say, a white counter, you could do white. It doesn't take much. And I'll grab a rag. Just gonna use our finger. Push that in there. Make sure we get all the gaps filled. If you need to add a little more, you can. Again, that's why we tape, in case you make a mess. And then we're obviously leaving the tape on the back to protect the wall, but we're gonna pull. I need to put some here too. We wanna caulk all our seams. So then we'll pull the lower one. Now we got a nice tight seal. It's locked that tape in on the bottom there, so any bleed marks from the primer aren't gonna be able to go through that tape edge.
Want to talk for a minute on how to properly prep a tile countertop. Now, tile countertops can require some of the most work, but it doesn't have to be that hard. So I want to walk you through one of the best ways to handle tile countertops. Now, we've typically seen two different types of tile countertop. The first type is where you have the edge of the counter that also has tile. So what they do is they actually trim out the counter first with a tile, a tile edge piece, and then they fill in the middle with the rest of the tile. That's one way. We've also seen people that have wood edges around the counter, and then it has an inlay of tile inside of that. I want to address both of those. If you have the inlay where you actually have it trimmed out, the countertop trimmed out in wood, that's the easiest to go over, no problem. What you're going to do is sand all the wood on the outside, just like we've sanded here. You're going to use 80 grit sandpaper on a palm sander or an orbital sander. To scuff that up. And then it's important that you scuff up the tile itself to remove any factory finish. Obviously, tile is designed for products not to stick to it. That's why it's easy to clean. So we want to try to remove that. Now, if you're going to try to remove that, we recommend that you use like a real heavy duty sandpaper to try to eat through that if you can. Some tiles, you might not even be able to get through that. But this is like a 36 grit sandpaper. If you absolutely can't get through the tile, but you've scuffed it up with this really well, then you may opt to grind it. You can actually grind through the tile very quickly. This is just a simple angle grinder, like from this one isn't from Home Depot, but you can get them from Lowe's, Home Depot, almost any place. And this is what's called a 4-inch diamond cup wheel. Pretty inexpensive. You can get them for around $40 or $50, sometimes less expensive. And this is again, this would be considered a 4-inch angle grinder. And with these two products, you can eat through almost any hard surface. So if you do that, you might want to get what's called a dust shroud for it. They also sell these. Before you put the diamond cup wheel on, you would slip this dust shroud over it, tighten it up, and then put the cup wheel inside of that so that you can hook it up to a vacuum. And when you're grinding, you'll be able to collect a majority of the dust. Now, obviously, ideally, you don't have to use an angle grinder to grind up your tile. If you're dulling out the tile, chances are it's fine. You can go over it. Our primer bonds extremely well to tile that's even been dulled out a little bit. So don't worry too much if you're able to remove some of that factory finish. Now, if it's taking you a long time, you probably just should opt to do that. We recommend using a palm sander, or some people call it an orbital sander, obviously hooked up to some sort of a vacuum system. That's always going to be the safest bet. So once you've sanded the wood and you've sanded the factory finish off the tile, the easiest thing to do now is to just take your tape. We do this a lot for dirty pours. And what you're going to do is you're going to run a couple strips of tape, not blue tape. You're going to run this Scotch tape really high. You're going to leave anywhere from 3/4 of an inch to an inch high all the way around your counters. So you're going to dam this thing up all the way around your counters. And you're going to do it with 2 thicknesses of tape. Now obviously, for demonstration's sake, I'm just doing this corner, but you want to run this tape. And now again, you have tile on the inside of here, if you have tile counters most likely. This is just for people that have wood on the outside, not tile on the outside bordering the countertop. And you're just going to level out this counter with a clear coat of epoxy. It's very simple, just a clear coat of epoxy. Now we recommend that you use the primer from your countertop kit first to prime your tile. So that'll really help the epoxy bond. Then when you do your next coat of epoxy with your decorative colors, you can just go directly onto the epoxy. You don't need to prime it again. But we recommend that you roll on your primer on this tile and then level out the tile to get rid of all of the grout lines. Now for 50 square feet of countertops, you're probably going to need about 1.5 gallon kit of clear epoxy. Now 1.5 gallon kit of our countertop kit, it actually comes with 1.5 gallons. So you're gonna need an additional 1.5 gallons to level out the epoxy. And then you can come back the next day and pull all the tape off all of your counters. And then you'll actually be able to take a sander. You might have to wait 1.5 days maybe, whenever it's pretty hard where you can sand on it, and then you'll just want to round the counter a little bit and take off any imperfections on that, just like we did on this wood. Now, let's talk for a minute if you don't have wood on the edge of your counter. If you have tile on the faces and on the top, you have an extra step. So you're still going to sand the factory finish off of all of the tile on top, but you're also going to do that on the faces as well. But instead of being able to flood the countertop completely, obviously if I flood the countertop without any tape, it'll just run off the counter and it truly won't level out the counter. But I can't put tape on this tile because I can never push that tape in enough on the grout lines on the face of this counter to stop the epoxy. So if I have grout lines, because I have tile on the face of my counter, the epoxy is always going to want to run down those grout lines and drip onto the floor. So the way we combat that is we sand off all the factory finish off the tiles on the faces. Then we use Bondo, the same thing that we patched all of our counters with here, all-purpose putty. It's made by Bondo. It's an all-purpose putty. You can get it at Home Depot. And I'm going to fill in all of the grout lines on the face of the counter. Now, don't pull them sideways with the grout line. Always go the opposite direction of the grout line. So if your grout lines are running vertically, which most of them will be in this case, always pull it up that vertical grout line. You want to be pulling and bridge the gap of that grout line to fill it in. Then you can sand that flat and then tape it off just like I showed you and flood the top of the countertop. Now, some of you might be thinking, why don't I just Bondo all of the counter? You absolutely can. It's going to be a lot of Bondo and it's going to be very strenuous, trust me. It's not that bad if you have to just Bondo putty the faces of the counters and sand them flat and then tape on those, but it's pretty miserable to do all of your counters with Bondo, especially if you have the little 1 by 1 inch tiles. Now if you have a 12-inch by 12-inch tile, we've seen that a lot too, and there's not a lot of grout lines, you absolutely can use Bondo on those as well. But typically, anytime somebody has a tile counter, we recommend that you flood it, because tile is almost never flat. You're always going to have imperfections in how the tile was laid. So we do recommend that you actually level out the tile with a clear coat of epoxy. The benefit is you're gonna have a pretty stout, rigid countertop to do the decorative coat, the actual countertop kit on if you go through that process. You're gonna have the wood, the thin set, the tile, all the grout in the tile, and now a clear coat of epoxy. That's a pretty stout counter. So that's the benefit of going over tile as well. Okay, I want to talk about if you're going over granite, marble, concrete, maybe even Corian to an extent, any seamless hard surface. I know you can also get granite or marble tile. If you have granite or marble tile, just watch the tile section, because it really goes more with the tile section than what I'm talking about. I'm going to go over if you have a seamless hard surface. Again, granite, marble, Corian, concrete, or surfaces comparable to that. And the biggest thing you want to do is remove any factory finish or scuff it up really well. Now, if you can actually scuff up your granite, your marble, your hard surface using, like a palm sander, an orbital sander with 36-inch grit, more power to you. We recommend that. And same idea, you wanna round the corners a little bit. Most of the time, those type of counters do already have a little bit of a round edge to them. They're not perfect 90-degree corners, because when they're actually going through the process to polish them, it's pretty abrasive to start with, so they naturally have these rounded corners. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to do much with some of those counters except for maybe Corian or concrete. Believe it or not, you can scuff up concrete and Corian pretty easily by using an orbital sander with 36 grit palm sander. Now, if you have like a solid slab of granite or marble, or even if you're outside, what's really fast is you can use an angle grinder and what's called a dust shroud. This dust shroud goes on this angle grinder underneath this. This is called a diamond cup wheel. This is a 4-inch diamond cup wheel. You can get all this stuff at Home Depot. It's pretty inexpensive. And this dust shroud hooks up to a vacuum and it goes under here. So when you're actually going over and prepping your hard surface, like your concrete, your granite, your marble, you're just gonna go really fast. This thing will be spinning and it'll just eat away at the surface. Now, again, you don't have to get that radical. Most of the time you can scuff it up with 36 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander and it'll eat through. What you're looking to do is you're just trying to put a lot of scratches, thousands of scratches into the surface, and if you can, even dull it out. If you bring it to that point where you're dulling it out, or all you feel is scratches and you see thousands of scratches, our primer will have absolutely no problem bonding to it. So if this really intimidates you, don't worry, don't even use it. Use the orbital sander with 36 grit, or you can use 50 grit, 80 grit if you want to, whatever you think is going to scuff through that surface really well. On the faces, I will say this: if you do opt to use something like this, like a diamond grinder, if you have concrete or any of these hard surfaces, if you have a solid stone, just know that this thing can spin at like 7,000 to 10,000 RPM. So if I have this really ramped up and it's spinning like crazy and I go to put it on the face of my counter, I'm gonna be bouncing off of it and I won't actually be grinding it, it'll be chipping it. These chip very, very easy when you're slamming a 10,000 RPM grinder into it. So, if you're used to using something like this, if you've used them before, definitely use it, that's no problem. You just wanna start with a little bit of pressure on it before you turn it on, and then just move quickly. Never try to necessarily round those corners because you'll just be bouncing off the corners, chipping the corners. The corners should really be done if you wanna sand them with the orbital sander. So hopefully that helps. Now in terms of prep, The goal is that on all of these surfaces, no matter what you're going over, the goal's the same. We're trying to remove any factory finish and create a rough to semi-rough surface with lots of pores, if there's that option, like concrete and some of these stones have, so that our primer will bond to it. Now, there's a lot of people who will go over things like granite, like Formica and all these things, that they'll have minor sanding and they'll roll on the primer. We just want to give you the best chance of success. Just to recap, no matter what type of counters you have, the number one goal is to just remove any factory finish you can, scuff it up a little bit. If it's concrete or a stone, open the pores. But you know, we've sold thousands and thousands of these countertop kits. They always stick when you do some of the most basic, easy steps. So we recommend, you know, the easiest thing to do is just get a palm sander, scuff it up a little bit. We guarantee that our WB primer will bond to it. We have the best primer on the market. So if you're a contractor, you want to get really radical and get into some of this heavy equipment, that's great. We're finding great success with just palm sanders.